Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath. And today we get to speak with Dr. Will Dobud. And he's written a cool new book, co-authored a cool new book called Kids These Days. I've started looking into this book, reading a bit of it, and I think it came out like late September or something like that. It's fairly new. I've started exploring this book. It's phenomenal. And we're going to look into a term that I really hadn't heard before, troubled teen industry. But when I heard it here recently and started looking into it, I was like, wow, okay, this is a term to describe something that has been troubling to me for some time. So we're going to jump into the troubled teen industry and anything else that strikes our fancy today. Dr. Will Dobud, welcome. Would you mind introducing yourself to the people?
Sure. So my name is Will. I grew up in Washington, D.C., studied social work in Maryland. And my journey, speaking of troubled teen industry, from like 19 years old, as a kid, I went to a lot of therapy because I was a naughty kid. And so I thought therapy was the coolest thing. I don't think it ever really helped. I didn't go to bad therapy, but I didn't go to very good therapy. And I was hooked. I thought group therapy ruled. And so when I had to figure out what the heck I was going to do with my life, I got a job working with young people in residential care. And I went, oh, I'll just do this forever. And this sounds cool. And that journey, as we talked before we were recording, that took me everywhere. I just was in a really fortunate position where I'd call up an agency and say, "Hey, can I come see what you're doing and work here for a bit?" And so it took me all over the U.S. and up to Alaska, and then I met my partner Renee. We actually met in Alaska, and she was Australian, and that's what dragged me to Australia. Met people from Norway, been to Norway a few times, and got to see the kind of work they're doing there. And while I'm not technically working today, in New Zealand today. So I've been really fortunate that the world of social work has also meant the world of seeing the world and working with people from different cultural contexts, different backgrounds, and never thought I'd dabble into the research world. I wasn't even that passionate about the troubled teen industry in America until I traveled away from America, and I looked back and went, oh, whoa, why was I trained that way? That sounds silly to me. And so, but I started realizing that really anybody can start writing things down. And when you write things down, you can hope that something sticks or makes an impact, or just be grateful that you had the privilege to write something and maybe someone published it for you. So that's been my life for the past sort of I guess it was always aligned like a pracademic, practicing and trying to figure out how to write things that are only with the client in mind, not trying to write another vanity, how to do therapy book. But no, so it's been an awesome journey, and so still quite, early career in the academic world, but been really fortunate that most of my adult life has just been about working with teens and families.
Okay, so many interesting routes to go here. First of all, you're making up words, pracademic. I love people who make up words. I feel like often the language we have doesn't describe things adequately, or it becomes stale. And so, all right, I'm already interested because you're making up words. This is great. Now, if I can stay with some of what you said you were a naughty kid. But then you said you liked therapy. Now, this is strange because often I've found, kids who are quote unquote naughty don't identify with therapy. They're not finding it to be particularly helpful. Now, you mentioned the group context in particular, but I'm wondering if you could talk some about, being a naughty kid, but also finding therapy to be interesting.
I think I was a really, really inquisitive child, and I was a very outdoorsy child. I grew up going to summer camp, and so this notion of older people being around and talking with you was really normal. But I found school dreadful. School, like, and this is the irony of working for an educational institution, of a university. But so it felt like therapy time was actually getting real about things and talking about things that mattered, where school was, I was treated as this passive recipient of something. Like I had to sit still, memorize, and then I was going outside doing these things, like climbing around sewers and things and being a wild child. But it was just this different time. Now, like I said, I don't think it made all that big of a difference, in my life. And so that's sort of what kicked off a passion of, I mean, to put it really bluntly, how do we not waste people's time in therapy? And so with kids, children know they're there because they're doing something wrong. I mean, as much as we say we want to help you, there's always a behavior tied to not getting out of bed, not coming home at night, not sitting still in the classroom. So there's all these behavioral indicators of why the kid's in therapy. And so I often think part of my passion was, how do we actually like make this stuff really cool again? Like, and so when it came to kind of finding outdoor therapy, I went, oh, this just naturally makes sense. And like all kind of niche therapies, there is a bit of me that I'm not sort of um, I'm not unaware to the point that we just push our outdoor hobbies onto our clients. Like no different than, I love music. I love playing music with young people. And so there's a bit of that at the same time. But how can we really revitalize this from a stale sit down in my office, I've got books on the wall. Sure, I've got a doctorate, not that you care. And how can we actually make this something that young people want to go to? So I view a lot of it from the lens of engagement. How do we get people to engage in things that could help them?
So you were saying that in terms of the troubled teen industry, that this wasn't really something that struck you as like particularly problematic until you left the United States and started working elsewhere and then saw how they were doing it. And then something struck you as different. And I'm wondering if you can talk some about what you observed.
So when I worked in for wilderness therapy programs, I was just an outdoor guide. And so, or like I was there outdoors in the woods with the groups for long periods of time. And I loved it. A therapist would come out and tell us, this kid's going through this diagnostic criteria or this stuff. And I'd sort of just roll my eyes and go, okay, well, I've been living out here and we're having a good time. So see you later. Um, didn't really think a lot of it. I knew there were problems of involuntary treatment. I was really, as a field staff, and I'm not making any excuses for this industry, but as the field guide, you're sort of cushioned from all of this because you just get the young people and you go out to the woods and it's pretty good. Like, difficult things happen, but that's the nature of being outside. It's the nature of working with people. And what happened is I came to Australia for one of my first visits, got a job at this really large nonprofit organization. They gave me a group of 10 kids from rural Australia that I knew nothing about. And then I'm plopped in the woods into the bush, let's use their language, with a map and compass. And I just sat there and I went, so they can all leave whenever they want to. Huh, that changes things. So one of the things that really bugged me when I had left the woods, then I started working in outpatient programs and I wasn't any good. I was not good at making the most of 1 hour with somebody, where if you have a captive audience, and I use the word captive as like a seriously captive audience, then you have more time. But I looked back and I started having to unlearn the way that I was trained. And then the other part that was challenging for me is I started with another social worker, an aftercare program. So for kids leaving wilderness therapy programs in Maryland. And then the whole facade of this is the most effective treatment on planet Earth, that all vanished for me. And I started talking to people who were saying, I would never go back to the woods. And I started thinking, but the woods is like liberation for people. The outdoors is incredible. And you had Thomas Doherty on recently, like he's a colleague of ours. Like this view of using nature for all the wrong reasons as a therapy. I just went, this is backwards. So my doctoral research is when things really rattled for me. And I just interviewed people that had been to all different types of outdoor therapy. And I interviewed young people who said, I went to this program in, let's say, Arizona, and it was the greatest experience of my life. Look at my full sleeve tattoo dedicated to finding myself. And the next person I interviewed said, I was at that same program in Arizona. I was chucked out of my sleeping bag in my underwear and forced to all. And I went, oh, and I know you've written about narrative stuff before. There's there's something about the meaning making that's really troubling to me, which is why are we forcing all kids to experience the exact same intervention, and in a way that we're making them experience something that could be the worst thing they've ever experienced in their life. And that I went, this is totally backwards. And and so, we could talk about the corporate interests, shell companies, the whole industry. It is a wild story. But I think as when I talk about it, and I know, like, especially if I'm in Australia, they'll say, "Why is this relevant to what we're doing? We don't kidnap children and force them to be in the woods for 90 days and all this stuff." And but the kind of the the case illustration of this is how much kind of standardized boxed therapy we do force on everybody. And so we talk about tailoring and individualizing and how we do this, but still there's government approved lists of which therapy you can do, where you can do it, how you can do it, what you're insured to do, what you're not insured to do, what diagnosis is required to get third party payments. All of this sets up a system that really has nothing to do with clients. It's got everything to do with a risk society. And so the troubled teen industry was just this huge sort of, it opened my eyes to, here's the most egregious version of how we think about clients, which is they have to be in front of the therapist until they get better. Then they can go on and live their lives. So, and I think there's a great book called Saving Psychotherapy by Ben Caldwell. And he wrote this is probably 2017, I'd say, guessing the year. But he has a great line, which is, eventually there will be a revenge of the clients if we don't really fix this. And look at the troubled teen industry. Look at what Paris Hilton did for tens of thousands of kids who were harmed by these practices. She used her platform, gave all these kids a voice, and programs are closing. Why? They'll tell you it's bad press. I'll tell you it's because of the revenge of the clients. Parents are now awake to this idea that there's these harmful practices out here. Yes, it's got a really nice brochure. You'll remortgage your home to be able to afford to send your child to this place, and then it's not all it turns out to be.
Understanding that, of course, people, and you alluded to this, people's experiences are different, so it can be helpful for one person and not for another. But you're talking about something that seems more systemic here. And I'm starting to really get a feel for it. But I'm wondering if you could go into even a little more depth in defining troubled teen industry. Like, what is this? What is the practice of this?
So I wouldn't, this is probably embarrassing for me to admit, I probably don't know where the term came from. But when you look at, I guess here's kind of a historical example.
Yeah.
At Outward Bound travels from Europe, the ideas of Outward Bound, over to the US. In Massachusetts, they started thinking, instead of incarcerating children, what if we sent them to the woods? And it turned out recidivism rates were better for kids that did an Outward Bound program than kids that went to juvie or whatever. And I mean, this is the 60s, there's issues with that data. If you get to Brigham Young University in Utah, a bunch of people created a program for freshman students where if they were struggling to get into the routine of college, not doing their homework, whatever, they could stay enrolled if they went on this sort of survival course. And it appeared to work, really well. At this similar time, the 28-day model of rehabilitation inpatient, where did that number come from? It's one moon cycle. This 28-day model starts coming about. So the folks from this Brigham Young University program started a foundation in Arizona where they were going to work with, troubled teens. And they were a nonprofit. They really, I think, wanted to do this the right way. They had a rift in their team. And one of them said, we have to be for profit and we have to bill insurance. So we have to start looking at this like behavioral health care. That's how we're going to get reimbursed for these things. And that seemed to take off like wildfire. You can trace wilderness therapy programs back to that, and they all kind of look the same. So they splinter off and they create a new behavioral health center somewhere else, another one. At the same time, what happened is you have this also rise in therapeutic boarding schools, in residential treatment centers, mostly in states where regulation is the easiest to be. So Utah, like, it's residential treatment for kids is a huge boost to the Utah economy. I saw someone on social media saying these programs can't close. This is Utah's livelihood. I'm like, your livelihood is hurting kids? That doesn't sound good, Right. So the industry component, the reason we're calling it an industry is there's this really fascinating collusion between wilderness therapy, and I'm generalizing a lot here. So a family is really struggling with their child. They might go see what's called an educational consultant. My kid doesn't go to school. I can't get them to come home. Maybe they're doing drugs. And they say, don't worry, this wilderness therapy program is really good for them. And they say, well, we're never going to get them to a wilderness therapy program. No worries. We'll hire a transport company. They'll come pick up your child in the middle of the night, send them to the woods. They'll go to the woods. It's very effective treatment. And then what they don't tell parents is something like 80% are going to be referred to a therapeutic boarding school. And then they go to therapeutic boarding school for 2 years. Then they go to a, halfway aftercare program. And so there's just this trail. And by the end of it, you have a teenager who had no prom, no first kiss, no getting a driver's license. And they've just been in this for-profit institutionalization for their entire teenage years. Now, one part that's really, really icky about this, and I look at it from the wilderness therapy lens just because that was my outdoor work, and we've gone through the data. About 25 to 30% of these kids that get sent away are adopted. So there's a bit of this that also looks like a de-adoption process, which is incredibly icky, very difficult. So you have families who could still be taking funding for having an adopted child while also having their child housed by other people. And so it's totally complicated. And so there's tons of money involved. A lot of them, especially before the global financial crisis in 2008, you'd say, oh, that person owns this program, but they were all owned by, let's say, like Bain Capital, like Mitt Romney's, or like, so there's all of these private equity firms also involved in owning these organizations. So it is like it is like sort of tinfoil hat how the heck this ever happened. But I'm not plugging the book here because we can talk about that later, but it does get into how we think about children, that we have to put them away for them to figure out how to not be like children. It's bizarre. So this is tens of thousands of kids a year. And yes, there are organizations working with the toughest of the most troubled teenagers, but what we find in the data is you have kids sent because they drink beer and skateboard and don't go to school. Like, to me, that kid sounds awesome. We have kids sent for their sexual orientation. We have children sent for, self-harming on a level that does not even warrant anything close to 2 to 3 years of institutionalization. And no third party judge, lawyer, no advocate for the youth as to why don't you need therapy. So I don't know. There's this amazing, and I'm going to sound really like a critical ass here. There's this amazing. Ulrich Beck, this German sociologist, wrote this phrase about a risk society where you're controlling for risk so much, but by the end of it, no one's responsible for anything. And so he used this term I love called organized irresponsibility. So
Ooh.
as a social worker, like we have the NASW, all of these programs that are doing these things have licensed social workers at them. We have the Joint Commission, we have state licensure, we have all of these people that are responsible for overseeing something. And it took Paris Hilton and young people who were harmed to get these programs to close. So it looks organized, all the accreditations, insurance in the world, and it's only when it gets to the point. I mean, in last 2024, we have a 12-year-old dead on the first day of a wilderness therapy program who was put into a bivy which is it's like a Gore-Tex small one-person tent for like it's a piece of alpine like you'd sleep in one on Everest, like in North Carolina, a 12-year-old dead, zip tied into a bag, and the organization comes out and their first response is we followed all policies and procedures. And you think, why on earth was a bivy even involved in your policy and procedures? Why was a child secluded away in an improvised restraint, a 12-year-old? And then all of a sudden, the state of North Carolina says this program has no license to operate anymore. And we go, we're only reacting after this tragedy. So that's where, like, in some ways, even though it's nice to think like, oh, the regulators, it's a pain in the ass, it's so much paperwork, but it would be nice if there was a bit more teeth to take care of this agency or this industry, sorry.
Wow. Okay. I want to back up just for a minute. And I'm woefully ignorant, I'm finding out here, because when you're referencing the work that Paris Hilton was doing, I don't know what you're referencing. Is it all right if you deconstruct that a little and talk about what she's been involved with and kind of the outcome from it?
Amazing. So Paris in 2020 had a documentary come out. I think it was called This is Paris. And she talked about a lot of the programs she was sent to as a kid and sexual abuse, what she was subject to. It was obviously disgusting. And what that did, it was like I'm speaking, this is not my experience. So from people that I've spoken to, they see Paris standing in front of the Capitol building saying we have to like stop this troubled teen industry and we need laws to protect against institutional child abuse. And I think there were a lot of people who were seriously harmed at these programs who felt scared to talk about it, probably felt immense shame, guilt, trauma of what they've went through. And I'll twist this on its narrative head. She did something, Paris coming out and talking to politicians, using her platform to talk, starting, advocacy agencies. What happened is there was this notion of this quote, I see you survivor, that I see you who's gone through this thing. So these young people turned into survivors. We survived the troubled teen industry. And that became a really empowering message for a lot of people. What happened after that is documentaries start coming. And again, this is all 30 years way too late, but change has to happen when the tide is right. And so the documentary, The Program, that's about a therapeutic boarding school. Hell Camp is about wilderness therapy. There's a movie coming out or is out right now in the US called The Wilderness. That's more of a Hollywood take on it. Wayward on Netflix is about an industry for children. That's really popular at the moment. So all of it, it made it to, it put it in the public conscious. So this is something we can talk about. And so her advocacy work is really amazing. And like, I mean, she endorses kids these days. Would I have ever thought my life would be somewhat one degree of separation from Paris Hilton? But I feel honored to be next to what she has done is I think for a lot of young people it is seriously it's helping them reauthor their own story of what they went through.
Mm, thank you for sharing that. And so it sounds like there's been a real groundswell of
Mm.
conversation now about this. And as I'm thinking about this, I mean, I always had a sense about, as someone who's been a therapist for over 2 decades now and
Mhm. Yeah.
has worked with young people, there was always something that didn't sit right with me about these places. I guess the first thing that really bothered me was the price. I mean,
Oh my
just the
God.
cost of them was so prohibitive. And I understand if you're housing someone for 90 days or something, that costs money and all the things, but like, geez, I mean, the cost would just bankrupt, most families. And so as I always had a skepticism of it, but was ignorant to some of the inner workings of it, which, you are just in this conversation and then through some of your writing, et cetera, helping me see. But with the understanding that there's rarely just one cause, when
Mhm.
you start to think about how this came to be, you talked about the history of it, but I mean, was it mostly about money? Is because people were making big money? Or, you said something earlier that really struck me when you said to make children not like children. And then it has me wondering, like, well, what's at stake here in terms of making young people become certain kinds of people, right? That aren't like young people. And so maybe some of it has to do with social control or other things. But when you think about like what the aim was of these programs, was it just financial or were there other aspects that you see as well?
This is like it depends on who you ask this question to because I met people who started organizations that I'd be hypercritical of. I've met some who I think, oh, this is just about money. And I've met some who really have their heart in the right place,
Mm,
but probably similar to who I was 20 years ago, thought I can do the right thing in the wrong system. And
mm,
then, but what happens when you leave that is you still bring parts of that system with you. Um, and so there's this tricky, um, I mean, everybody likes making money, and what better way to make money than helping people? Like no one, I mean, surgeons get paid a lot of money, we all get it. But I do think there is something the way these organizations were set up, and I guess here's it because with most of your audience, and I'm a part of it as being therapists. A tricky thing happens when, especially in inpatient and residential care, a tricky thing happens when a young person comes. They usually come with a fat file of what's wrong with them and the descriptions of why they need to be here. And then you're paid until they're better. And so who decides when they're better, right? So that's why all these programs say 28-day minimum. Like, but why not like, let's do 1 week and then see if it's the right place for you or not. What happens between 21 days and 28 days that's so magically different? Not much. So these ideas don't come from evidence-based, they come from funders. So the third-party payer dictates a lot of this. So trying to mold these programs into what someone else will pay for made it a financial interest as well. But it's sort of like I think this is another really icky part of all of this. And when we were writing Kids These Days, we talked to an environmental toxins researcher, right? Which was terrifying. Now, I don't think someone who works in the factory making, let's say, something like Roundup is thinking, let's kill weeds and give everybody cancer. This sounds like a wonderful idea. I think a lot of this is that systemic, no one's going to go out, ideally, not many people. Well, the majority of people aren't going to go out and just poison everybody, right? But still, we know about it, so let's do something about it. That's the part where the industry, it's been really hard to change because there's people who really, really believe in helping young people. There's a lot of people who believe in hurting young people. And so it's hard. It requires a messy, nuanced conversation instead of being on the poles of these kids need this or no, you're hurting children. We need to find a way to help find reform, which does start with not harming children, of course. Um, but to have that conversation is incredibly complicated because I've never met a therapist that says, I work at an agency that harms children and I can't wait to stay working here, you know?
Right.
Hmm.
Well, and the messy conversations are so often the ones that we need to have, right?
Yeah,
But because they're messy, they're difficult, and often our own cognitive dissonance or whatever gets in the way. And I think it's hard for us as therapists, just in general, sometimes to acknowledge the ways in which we may not be serving people or even harming people. I mean, with drugs, for example, we talk about side effects.
yeah,
That's just a common practice of pharmaceuticals, but there have been some people, but we rarely talk about the negative side effects of therapy, to which there are plenty, right?
sure.
It's just this
Yeah,
idea that, and like on one hand, in the modern age, this is, I think, a net positive that now people are considering quote unquote mental health. I don't know what the hell that term even means anymore, but they're concerned about and valuing mental health, right? It's all over TikTok and all the things, and
oh yeah,
this is great because at least it's in the public consciousness. However, then there can be this idea that everybody needs to go to therapy and
yeah,
that therapy is good. And I often worry about that because therapy isn't inherently good. Therapy that is a good fit for the person that is engaged with it can be good, right? But
yeah,
just this notion that therapy is good. And if therapy is good and a young person is quote unquote struggling, well, then 90 days at some sort of inpatient, wherever it is, that must be really good, right? And so
yeah.
some of the way that the kind of rationale that this follows can seem problematic to me, just this notion that therapy is good.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, this is a good rant away from wilderness therapy, but you know, therapy works. There's no doubt about that, but it works when you have an engaged client engaged in the process. That does not mean coerced into the process. That means engaged into something that fits their worldview, cultural background, all of these ways that we tailor things. So what we have played along with as a therapy field, therapy in the Western world, is this notion that what's wrong with somebody is inside of them. And so we need to find a way to, if you're psychoanalytic, we need to find the unconscious. If it's cognitive behavioral, we got to deal with the thinking. PTSD, we got to move your eyes back and forth and rewire your brain. We keep coming up with stories of what's wrong, and here's the treatment. Now, no matter how long we've done that, does anything seem to be getting better in the world of mental health? No. We talk about we need to improve accessibility. Yeah, we've been talking about that for 30 years and we have more therapists than ever before. And now we have TikTok. So we have pseudo therapists all over the place. And what we see is this rise of self-labeling. And so while we were writing kids these days, we actually found this study that was really interesting. They tracked, I think it was sixth graders over 2 years in California, so between sixth and eighth grade, and children that self-identified with a mental health label in sixth grade. If they dropped it when they were surveyed again in eighth grade, largest increase in self-esteem. So
Mm.
the labeling might not be what's helping. So we talk about we need to raise awareness of, neurodiversity or trauma or these things. And inherently, they're very thin descriptions of what somebody experiences. So in the therapy leaving look at fidget spinners, tapping, all these things that are leaving the counseling room and entering the general public. One warning sign is ch children or anybody internalizing these concepts. And so I think as therapists, we also have a duty of care to help people navigate what it inherently means to be human, to experience the world. Um, and you can do that through any of the 1,000 brands of therapy. Not everyone needs to work outside. Not everyone needs to be an EMDR specialist. Like, I have a connection to solution focused. My house in Adelaide, I'm 5 minutes down the road from the Dulwich Center. I like narrative things. Um, we don't have to be one thing or the other, and we don't need to fight with each other about which one is best because that's also not an evidence-based discussion. But you're absolutely right that there's a warning of us siloing away into planet mental health, and that's going to make our job as therapists a bit more difficult when clients might be coming with these entrenched narratives about who they are and what these concepts mean.
You're speaking my language now. So one thing you said earlier, you said, how do we not waste people's time? Which I think is
Yeah.
a lovely endeavor. So in therapy, how do we not waste people's time? And then you also said, how do we make it cool again? And I think this is true for anyone, but I think especially young people. And so I'm interested in how you go about answering those two questions. How do we not
Cool.
waste people's time, and how do we make it cool again?
Love it. Not waste people's time. I want you to imagine you're getting off work. Maybe you get in the car with a friend. Maybe you pick up a partner. Maybe you get on a bike or public transport and you go, you know what? I'm hungry. So you go to this restaurant, you open the door, and they say, the front of house comes up at this restaurant. Maybe it's a nice restaurant. Maybe it's your favorite hole in the wall. And they say, how can I help you? And you say, I'd like a table for two. I'm feeling kind of hungry. And then they say, hold on a second. And they pull out a clipboard and they say, can you tell us how risky your hunger is right now? Is this hunger related to your mother? How long have you been neuro hungry for? Is this related to trauma? Tell me the intensity of your hunger. Okay, come back next week and then we'll help you with your hunger. And we get to choose what you eat.
I'm hungry, damn it.
Just feed me. So we have this intake assessment model that inherently, like in Australia, and I'm using this as a national case study because we have a bit more of a socialized system of universal health care. We have this national youth service that gets millions and millions of dollars. Great people work at it. The concept behind it is really nice. The most common number of sessions any child goes to is one. And then what they did was this clever storytelling. But we trained all our therapists in single session therapy. That's like going on a great blind date and going, this was the greatest date I've ever had, but I don't want a second date. It's bull crap, right? So if good therapy tends to keep somebody engaged. So we should really start from a place of engagement. Now, how to make therapy cool again, segueing from that. In the 1930s, and this is a cool link to outdoor therapy, weirdly enough, that we found going down the rabbit hole. In the 1930s, one of the first child and adolescent psychiatry conferences, they said, like, basically, instead of coming up with all these medications, of which we didn't have as many as we have today, um, in, let's try to have experiences of success and mastery in therapy. So those two words together, success and mastery. What's fascinating, in the 70s, when outward bound programming, they knew it was working for recidivism rates. They knew it was good for leadership skills for kids. And I don't get paid from outward bound, so I have no connection to the organization. One of the things, researchers came in, looked at the model, and they said, oh, this reorients young people because of experiences of success and mastery. And so this experiential education and this therapy world, they're kind of coming together here with this idea of success and mastery. In the 80s, you have Kenneth Howard looking at dose effect in therapy. And we're really nerding out here for a second.
Please.
So what they found was, you know, we don't argue about this as much. I see it on social media with the psychoanalytic folks. Brief therapy or long-term therapy.
Yep.
And what Kenneth Howard found is if you use self-report measures, people actually all change at the same pace. So if it's session 8 and a client hasn't said things are going in the right direction, the chances of you doing good work is reduced. Again, generalizing. The issue with that is the government will say, well, we're only going to pay you for 8 sessions, right? So it's a double-edged sword of a finding. But what Kenneth Howard says, this again comes from Persuasion and Healing, my favorite therapy book. Bruce Wampold jumped on, new edition just came out this year. The 93 edition of that book rattled my world. So Jerome Frank, who wrote the first editions of this in the 60s and 70s, said, what's a commonality of all clients that come to therapy? And so today we'd say it's probably trauma, right? But he was saying, no, what's their experience? What are they experiencing when they come? And so he said it's most likely demoralization. So think if we're a child, my parents think I can't handle this myself, right? Or if you're in a struggling relationship and one person says you have to go to therapy or else, right? They go, or if you're court ordered, I just have to be here. And so what Kenneth Howard found back to the 80s was the faster a client can experience a sense of remoralization, the more likely they're to remain engaged in therapy. So then we don't have to talk about brief or long term. The more likely they're going to do the work that we're asking them to do. And so a key to that could be success and mastery. And there's a few pathways to this. Like, some people, we see this with, I teach at a social work university, so inherently an older student population. And I'm seeing this a lot rising nowadays, is a lot of older women are coming in and they come to me as someone who ticks every box of ADHD, though I don't find the label all that interesting for me. But so it's part of me. It's just my neural network, I guess. A lot of older women, they'll come up to me and say, when I found out at 45, it was liberating. Like I was like, oh, this is the way my brain works. And so now I'm thinking about, it's okay for me to stay up till 1 a.m. doing my homework. I don't need to pretend that I'm going to go to bed at 9 p.m. like everybody else. I can find the way that I work with the world. So this understanding of who you are is a great way towards remoralization. I get it. Another one, the therapeutic relationship. I'm in the right place. Someone gets me. I think this person can help me. And then another one is if you're doing techniques, if you want to do mindfulness activities, if you want to go for a walk, if you want to do any the techniques associated with the model, that when the client does them, they experience this sense of mastery, this sense of success. So, for instance, one of the examples I always use talking about outdoor therapies is I often, if I take a school group out into the bush of Australia, I'll hear from teachers. They don't sit still. They don't do their homework. They fight back when they're told what to do. All these things we hear about kids. And then it might be raining, and I'm watching this child make a fire with just a flint and steel, which is a pain in the ass in the rain. And they're sitting still doing it, and they're focused and engaged. And I'm going, how are you able to do that? Tell me about this. So, in essence, one way to find success and mastery is to be really curious about it. When are you at your best? And now I'm sounding like solution-focused, Will. But looking for these clues can help you to boost engagement. And so we want to focus on the relationship, focus on remoralization, making sure that the way we see the client is the way they want to be seen. And then think about, can we provide experiences where they can sort of create a culture of competence around them? And so the opposite of that is making everybody cognitive behavioral, or making everybody's eyes move, or making everybody go to the woods, or making everybody go to a troubled teen industry program. That has been and we when we write about this in kids these days, like that's actually the failure, is the homogenizing of people. And as a social worker, as someone totally into a profession of social justice, administering the same intervention to everybody just seems totally antithetical to the profession that I'm a part of.
But why do we do that so damn much? And the thing is even, I've been fortunate enough to be trained by David Epstein, and narrative therapy influences what I do quite a bit. But I see the same shit of therapy, right? That no one's immune to this, where it's like, oh, this is the way. This is what we have to have everybody do, the homogenization. So we have our models, and then we expect people to sort of conform to these models. And then if they don't in some way, they're problematic. And I think some models are maybe more at risk for this than others in certain contexts or whatever. I'm not trying to say everything's equivalent here, but why do you think we do this, where we want a one size fits all so badly?
I think this is actually well, for me, and I think there's a deceptively simple answer to this. And all we have to do is look at politics, that you're this color or you're that color. You're red or you're blue. You're either so what happens is, when a new therapy emerges, they have a charismatic leader. Carl Rogers, Michael White, Steve DeShazer and Insu, Aaron Beck, Marshall Linehan, Francine Shapiro. We know the name of the person, right? And then we go, shit, I better learn from this person. So I go to that conference and we hear this from people all the time. I met my tribe, right? I finally met my people. And then when you kind of start realizing this is sort of the same thing as everything else, these are all, the difference of the therapies are razor thin, right? But we get tribalism, and we get tribal, and we get siloed away. And then, I mean, with a dear friend, I'm at a trauma and dissociation conference right now, right? And I'll tell you, we're out to dinner, the most lovely people. And I'm listening going, this is so wildly different than how I see things, right? Like, so different. But that's interesting to go see. So we end up going, why does no one recognize my therapy? Why does no one care that we're doing therapy in the outdoors? Why does nobody care about solution focused anymore? Why does narrative come and go in waves? Why are eye movements the most popular, and why does CBT get all the money? Like, all of this gets, one issue is we always have to defend our therapy because the type of therapy is the least important part of the story. So it's what gives us the value as the worker, where, and we all do this, where we all want to be strengths-based and all these nice things. And if you ever ask a therapist, what do you do? It starts with what's wrong with people. And it comes from the narrative usually associated to the model. So I work with trauma. I work with, depression and anxiety. And that's why I do CBT. Again, nothing wrong with any of these models, but we treat them like they're making up 99% of the change in the intervention. Now, here's a funny thing I learned while interviewing young people, and I found research, there's a lot of people who have done this and had this finding. When I talked with kids that went to these horrific programs, right? Some of them would say the adults were caring. They were kind. They held me to account. They were confrontational in a kind way when they needed to be. I'm not saying just go be confrontational with children. They'd say things like, they treated me like a human, like these really profound things. And then kids who had bad therapy experience, all they talk about is bad techniques. They hardly ever talked about they just tried to get me to journal all the time. They just tried to make me talk about my mother. They just tried to make me do this. They just tried to. So even with adults, when you talk to an adult who had a great therapy experience, what do they say? great listener. Like you can't tell someone what the technique of how they listened was. They understood me. They unconditional positive regard, all these things. They were there. They were present with me. And then what do you hear when it's bad therapy? They just tried to get me to do this. So the technique is also the thing most clients blame for why therapy goes wrong. And
Yeah,
it's
it's
what we
funny.
argue about the most.
Yeah, well, we do absolutely. I wrote my dissertation in my PhD program on clients' accounts of successful therapy versus therapists' accounts.
Yeah.
And I interviewed dyads after the therapy was over. If I had to do it over again, I would have done it as it was going along to see
Cool.
how it evolved. But basically, it
Cool.
found exactly what you're talking about. I mean, it was a narrative analysis, and clients would share things about like, oh, it was my birthday, and the therapist remembered it was my birthday
Yeah.
when they brought in pizza or whatever it was, or they would say things like, it felt like they were there because they wanted to be there and it wasn't just their job or that they were getting paid. All these things we already know at a pretty deep level if we do this work. And yet, when we go to these conferences and hey, I mean,
Mm.
listen, we have a conference here in San Diego I'm a part of next week, and same thing, like we're going to spend a bunch of time talking, well, maybe not. Maybe we'll try to deviate from this, but the way this
Sure.
often goes is we spend a bunch of time talking about theory and, talking about model and all of those things, and sometimes I feel like the person gets lost in that. Okay. I
Yeah.
We're moving closer to the end of our time together.
Sure. Yeah. No,
It's
it's been fun.
flying by, which
Yeah.
is
Great.
the sign of a good conversation. But I want to go back to something you were talking about very early on in this conversation. You were talking about yourself as a kid and like, you'd be climbing sewers, exploring sewers and things like this, which immediately that caught my attention. I was like, man, yes. Like this is
Yeah.
the kind of stuff I remember doing as a kid. And then a little bit later, you talked about how we're trying to make kids not like kids anymore, right?
Mm.
Because to me, each kid's a little different, but as a kid climbing sewers, doing that stuff, I mean, man, my imagination would be going wild with this sort of thing as a kid. And I'm wondering how you understand the society at large, including the mental health industry, trying to make kids not like kids. Like
Yeah.
what's going on there?
So this is where I'll take my time to plug this book that we wrote. And so kids these days, one of the things we did is Nevin, my co-author, he started this and he just started interviewing so-called experts, right? So like Scott Miller in psychotherapy, he's been a mentor of mine. We sat down, had a long talk with him. And then like the parenting side, like Gordon Neufeld wrote a great book with Gabor Mate called Hold On to Your Kids. Um, Michael Unger in social work's a resiliency expert. So people from a range of different ideas. And so it was really, in many ways, it was such a fun project because it pushed us into places that none of us would ever really go. While we were writing the book over the last few years, this whole social media is the devil thing came out, right? Kids these days are fragile. Kids these days are an anxious generation. Like all of them? All of them. And so we see this playing out. So we need phone-free schools. Okay, that sounds like the right idea. That sounds great. We want kids to be playing instead of being on the screens all the time. Sounds like the right idea. And I'm sitting there going, my kids grew up, and I know every parent and therapist does this where you talk about your own kids. So I'm sitting there going, why don't our kids to have their phones at the dinner table? And what's going on at their school where they're not on their phones all day at school? What's different? Like, is there a way to do this without this sweeping government legislative response to cell phones? And it's like the kids can't put them down. 20% of them have a mental illness. And and you look at the data, so do adults, the same 20%. And I'm going, are we going to put our phones down? Are we going to engage kids? Are we going to realize that school is not for everybody? Not that education is not for everybody, that school sometimes is not for everybody.
Mm.
And um and so I sat there while I was writing, and this is going to sound pretty judgy, but we talked with Martin Brokenleg, a Lakota Sioux man who wrote a book in the 90s with some other people called Reclaiming Youth at Risk. And that in Canada had become like the Bible of youth work. And Desmond Tutu wrote the foreword for that book, which is really cool. So it went to South Africa and became this big, and it was informed by, they made this model called a circle of courage model made by looked like the medicine wheel. It's really cool. And so we talked with Martin, and Martin said, when we were interviewing him, he said, we have these phones, and in many ways, like we all wouldn't be talking. I'm in New Zealand, you're in California. Like we're so, and he went, and Martin raised his hands and made air quotes. He goes, connected, but we're not connected. We're not connected like we should be. And we can blame the phones, or we can get to work as adults and do the connection work. So one of the things we started reading about, we see this data, there's a loneliness epidemic. Kids are actually telling us they're feeling lonely. At the same time, the average child is at a school with dozens of other children and dozens of other adults, 80% of their lives? What's going on in this place where a kid can feel lonely and invisible? And so, as adults, if our narrative is the way to fix them is to get rid of the phones, then they'll be kids again. Or more therapy, then they'll be kids again. Or all this stuff. To me, it's this great fixing that's the problem. And so it's important that we don't only live in the times that we live in. So in the 1940s, New York City banned pinball machines.
Yeah.
Milwaukee said no pinball machine can be played during school hours because of crime, because it looked like gambling. It looked like naughty behavior, right? It's frickin' pinball. And the thing with the bannings is when you ban something, it's really hard to get it back, right? So for instance, like during COVID, when I remember basketball is the first sport that stopped being played, right? Because we didn't know what we were doing and what we were dealing with. But once it stopped, there was no, how will we know when we can bring basketball back, right? How will we know when cell phones are, what age is actually appropriate for kids to be on? And I mean, social media sucks. I'm not advocating that it's all, it's all wonderful. But so there's this notion of kids doing kids things, being wild, not sitting still, like adolescence, being a know-it-all, being obnoxious. All of this stuff is actually totally natural, And so one of the really interesting things going back, and this is probably a good place to wrap up too. I know I'm keeping you as well.
No,
One of the
keep
things
going. This
this
is great.
You go back to when did our professions, psychology, social work, late 1800s, early 1900s, what were kids doing? They were either privileged enough to go to school or they were in a factory. And in a factory, what happened? Jane Addams, the so-called the mother of professional social work, right? Jane Addams has this book that I think I'm probably the only person championing 115 years later, called The Spirit of Youth and the City Streets. Now, let me tell you, hard to read, dense language. Jane Addams wrote about youth crime in Chicago. And what she wrote was, if you want crime rates in Chicago to stay this bad, you will keep kids in factories. And she said kids need to be, she has a chapter called The Quest for Adventure, where she goes through crime that kids were getting into, like stealing money from their parents, going to Chicago and buying clothes, right? And then what happened to them? They were sent to reform school. And Jane Addams says this is because parents couldn't deal with the broken spirit of the child that they themselves broke. So the joke of kids these days is it's really adults these days. And that's not blaming parents, that's not blaming therapists, but we just really want to hold ourselves, we want to challenge narratives of what's wrong with also what's really amazing about this child. And so what are they doing? So like when parents want me to work with their child, I'll say to them, but before we start, I do need a list of 10 things you do not want me to change about your child. And so I want to start with what makes this, I want to start with there's another quote from a philosopher like, if you're not willing to touch your students' strengths, don't go anywhere near their weaknesses. And sometimes it feels today when we live on planet Health, we spend far too much time with what's going wrong. Um, and it might not be the thing that leads us to clues about what is really working. So often when I think of the narratives that we have about the kids and what they're doing, they're also doing a pretty good job navigating a really complicated world. So I think if we started with, like when I hear like kids used to play outside till the street lights came on, it's like, but we live in different times now. We don't live in Leave It to Beaver. It's different now. And kids are doing a pretty good job navigating this. And when we look at the adults, and I'm from Washington, D.C., and I can't help but link everything to politics. Are we imitating talking to people that differ from us? Are we imitating how to have really good democratic conversations? Are we imitating good social media behavior? If we're not doing the thing that we want our children to be doing, then we can't just blame the child for that.
Uh, Amen. I'll say quickly that I've gotten rid of psychiatric intakes altogether, and where I
Mhm.
start therapy with young people and also adults is from a place of trying to understand their moral character, which a lot of people find bizarre. Well, people don't. Therapists do.
Yeah.
Therapists find it bizarre. People don't.
Yeah.
Um, but I've found that to be so much more useful. And why did I do psychiatric intakes? Well, because I was trained to do psychiatric intakes. And I noticed that I never used them for anything. I just started with them and they sat in a folder somewhere. And,
Yeah.
like then I would actually create, unwittingly, of course, more hopelessness. And it would take me 4, 5, 6 sessions to get out of that hopelessness. Now, one of the critiques that people will offer is like, oh, so you're ignoring the problems or what people are up against. No, not at all. I'm not doing that at all. I understand that people, when they come to see us, are often struggling. They're in distress. And I found it useful to know what they have to put up against all of that. And if we don't understand that, we're entering into a place where, at least for me, in the work that I was doing, I saw hopelessness increase,
Yeah.
which it was, gosh, that was a really, really disturbing when you're trying to help someone, right? And I'm trying to follow my formalized training, and I find out that what I'm actually doing is creating its opposite. This was really hard for me to reconcile for a really long time. Now, eventually with people, I might be able to get out of it, but I didn't realize that I was making it worse at the beginning. And this is not to call out psychiatry, psychology, counseling, social work. I understand that the practices have existed and exist for a particular reason, right? And that's fine. But my goodness, I think we could stand to be a little bit more critical of what's happening, question a little bit more why we're doing what we're doing, and not just, well, we've always done intakes this way, so henceforth we shall always do it that way.
Absolutely. I mean, amen to what you just said as well. And it's never, n- n- we would not stay in this work if we didn't think we were doing a good job. Otherwise, we'd all burn out because we'd go, why am I even doing this? You know, I'm not making a difference. You'd feel terrible. So, and this is sort of my plea to our field is if we get a bit more real about what we're doing that's not helping, and you can just start that by looking at your caseload. Ask your clients, do you think you're better from 6 sessions ago? Like, you know, get real that people can tell you what's not working and what's working. And then going back to not wasting people's time, you can get them somewhere else. So I always find it really sad when people say, I worked with this person for 20 sessions and now I'm starting over again. We hear this from kids who have grown up in foster care or out of home care. Every person, tell me your story again. And they're going, I've grown up with the government. I've grown up being told where to live. I have a new family every 2 years, and every time you're asking me to retell what happened to
Mm,
me. And so you have kids aging out of, um, when they age out of the foster care system or the out of home, any system, and it's just starting over all the time. And so there's a rightly so inherent mistrust of adults and people in leadership positions. And again, that's also normal for children, right? Because they know better than everybody else. But we could start from a place of, because I've worked in a little bit in that sort of foster care, out of home care system, and you should see how many of them will tell you, no one ever asks me what I want.
yep.
And we see it in aged care with older populations. You can't have that soft drink. You can't use that knife. You can't do this thing. No dignity of risk. And so you start thinking, could we ask a bit more of what people want? Are they experiencing a sense of mastery? Can we get to the point a little bit faster? And so, and I don't mean faster as in brief. I mean getting to engagement, engaging in the real stuff, getting to work. And so I'm 100% with you on that. Um, there are so many people who, when they've had a nothing or a bad therapy experience, going to a new therapist, we you might think we're starting from scratch in this relationship. For them, this is their entire relationship with our professions and their view of it. So, so I think whenever there's bad therapy, that's the chance to really role model. How do you help someone get to better therapy?
I love how you were talking about asking questions too. I always found it so bizarre early in my formalized training when I was told not to ask questions. And it's like, how do I come to know someone other than through questions, you know?
Yeah.
Um, Dr. Will Dobud, I really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoy your sort of rebellious spirit. You know, one distinction you made in this conversation that I just couldn't agree with more is the distinction between schooling and education, right?
Yeah.
I mean, these little sort of subtle differences that people take it for granted in their language, right? They talk about schooling and think that that's the same as education. And of course, it's not. And throughout our conversation, I really appreciated sort of the distinctions that you would draw, and you were thoughtful and careful about your language. And I can't tell you enough how much I wish we had more of that in our field. And I appreciate your willingness to be critical of the field, but also, you know, you were humble in looking at yourself and your own practices, which I appreciated as well. The book is Kids These Days.
Mm.
And boy, I can't wait to really dive into this, even more so after our conversation. And maybe you have to write a follow-up or something that's like adults these days. I don't know.
Well, adults these days is the last line of the book, which is,
Oh, it
which
is.
is, yeah, that's sort of the joke of the whole thing is that, hey, we have to, I mean, just I think as parting words, like one of the things with our field of therapy, and I love being a social worker. And I can tell you, speaking of schooling, when I started working for a university and I went, oh, that's what it means to be a social worker. That's who I work for. This is what I represent as these are our values. How do we actually do this in the schooling to make it a better education? And so my identity wrapped up in this. And then while writing the book, looking at cell phone bans and all these things, we interviewed this toxins researcher, Dr. Bruce Lanphier. For anybody on Substack, I will tell you, not sensationalist, not scary. Bruce Lanphier is awesome. And he's been on, California's attorney generals. He worked with the EPA. He's amazing at talking about toxins and mental health. Scary as shit, but it's worth diving into because here's one of the fascinating things, and I think this about every therapist with their boots on the ground. Over the last 10 years or so, we've started this movement of really, I mean, it's informed by feminist ideas that therapy is what we do is political, right? The personal is the political. And here's where I really align with this. There is so much bad therapy out there and so many bad, like troubled teen industry. Our work, with people, what we're doing has to be a demonstration of the highest, you said morals, I agree, of values, morals. We have to stick, we have to be the demonstration of this work. I remember after just writing peer-reviewed papers, I was trying to go after the wilderness therapy industry. And I remember this one time I had 10 kids. They get off this bus. We're in the middle of nowhere in Australia. And I started walking and I went, I better not mess this up, because if I mess this up, all the shit I threw at these other people doesn't matter anymore. So my work has to be, it means if I'm not doing good work, I have to fail successfully. I have to help that person get somewhere else. So in many ways, as therapists, we might have our boots on the ground and go, how can we make it so the licensing hours aren't so ridiculous? How can we make it easier for single mothers to become therapists so it's not just a bunch of dudes doing this work? How can we make it easier for people from less affluent areas to get into this field? That takes all of us together, not waiting around for other people to fix this system. And so our work, this conversation, you talking to other people, write stuff down. You have the story to share that gets other people involved in trying to make changes with this. So in many ways, what we do is political in the sense of that's your client that has that good experience goes to someone else and says, therapy really helped me. For every bad therapy story, that spreads further than the average good therapy story. So the sensationalism always sells. So we need to make good therapy sensationalized. And that takes what you do with each person.
Beautiful closing words. Dr. Will Dobud, I appreciate your time and look forward to future conversations together.
Absolutely. No, that's very fun. Thank you so much.